The morning sun painted the prairie grass gold as Sarah Mitchell stood at her kitchen window, watching the horizon where the railroad tracks disappeared into forever. 3 years had passed since she'd moved to this quiet subdivision on the outskirts of Millbrook, seeking peace after the storm that had torn her world apart. The HOA mandated white picket fence enclosed her small sanctuary, but it couldn't keep out the memories that still haunted her dreams. She pressed her palm against the cool glass, remembering another morning, another lifetime when she'd stood at a different window, watching for a different man to come home. But Marcus had never come back from that final cattle drive, and the telegram that arrived instead had shattered more than just her heart. It had destroyed her faith in love itself. The sound of her garage door opening echoed through the quiet. Neighborhood like thunder, Sarah winced, knowing it would wake her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, who complained about everything from the color of Sarah's roses to the way she parked her car. But Sarah had learned to live with small annoyances. After losing everything that truly mattered, petty neighborhood squabbles felt like whispers in a hurricane. She was backing her modest sedan out of the garage when she saw the woman marching across her lawn with the determined stride of someone looking for a fight. Karen Blackwell, the HOA president, wore her authority like armor and wielded her clipboard like a weapon. Her perfectly styled blonde hair caught the morning light as she approached, her face already twisted with righteous indignation. "Stop. Right there," Karen shouted, pointing an accusatory finger at Sarah. "I'm calling the police. You can't just steal someone's car in broad daylight." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she put the car in park and stepped out, raising her hands in a gesture of peace. "Mrs. Blackwell, I think there's been a misunderstanding. It's my car. I've owned it for lies." Karen's voice cracked like a whip across the quiet morning. "I bought that exact car yesterday from Henderson's Auto Sales. Same make, same model, same color. You're a thief, and I'm not letting you get away with it." Other neighbors began emerging from their homes, drawn by the commotion like moths to flame. Sarah felt the familiar burn of shame creeping up her neck. The same feeling she'd carried when she'd fled her hometown 3 years ago, pregnant and unwed, with nothing but a broken heart and a suitcase full of dreams that would never come true. "Please," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just let me show you my registration. It's in the glove compartment." Has been mine for over 2 years. But Karen was already dialing 911, her voice rising to a shriek that could wake the dead. "I need police immediately. There's a car thief on Maple Street. She's trying to steal the car I just bought." Sarah's hands trembled as she reached into her purse for her wallet, where she kept all her important documents. The registration was there, along with the insurance papers and the loan documents that proved her ownership. But as she pulled out the folder, something else fluttered to the ground, a photograph, worn soft with handling, of a man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. The sight of Marcus's face, even after all these years, hit her like a physical blow. She knelt to retrieve it, her vision blurring with unshed tears. In that moment, she wasn't Sarah Mitchell, suburban homeowner and part-time bookkeeper. She was Sarah O'Connor again, 19 years old and desperately in love with a cowboy hood. Promised to marry her when he returned from his last cattle drive. "Ma'am, we need to see some identification." The police officer's voice was gentle but firm. Sarah looked up to find 2 uniformed officers standing beside her car, their expressions professionally neutral. Behind them, Karen stood with her arms crossed, wearing the satisfied smile of someone who believed justice was finally being served. "Of course," Sarah said, struggling to her feet. Her legs felt weak, as if the past had reached across time to steal her strength. "This is my car. I have all the paperwork right here." Officer Martinez, according to his nameplate, examined the documents with careful attention, while his partner, Officer Thompson, took notes. The registration was clear, Sarah. Mitchell had purchased the vehicle 2 years ago from a dealership in the next county. VIN numbers matched perfectly. "Mrs. Blackwell," Officer Martinez said, turning to Karen with barely concealed impatience, "this vehicle belongs to Mrs. Mitchell. She has all the proper documentation." But Karen's face had gone pale, her eyes fixed on something beyond the officers. "That's impossible," she whispered. The car I bought. It was exactly like this one. Same everything. Officer Thompson cleared his throat. Ma'am, did you actually take possession of the vehicle you purchased? Do you have the keys? The silence stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Karen's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. And Sarah felt a flicker of sympathy for the woman who'd just realized her mistake. But before anyone could speak, another voice cut through the morning air like a blade. Sarah, the world tilted on its axis. Sarah turned slowly, afraid to trust her ears, afraid to hope. But there he was, walking up the sidewalk with the same easy stride she'd watched 1,000 times in her dreams. Marcus Cole, older now, his dark hair touched with silver at the temples, wearing a police uniform instead of cowboy clothes. But his eyes, those warm brown eyes that had haunted her for 3 years, were exactly the same. Marcus. His name fell from her lips like a prayer answered too late. He stopped 10 feet away, his face a canvas of shock and disbelief. The fire. ... They told me you were dead. The world around them faded into background noise. Karen's protests, the murmur of gathering neighbors, the crackle of police radios. Everything disappeared except the space between Sarah and the man she'd never stopped loving. I waited, Sarah said, her voice breaking. I waited for you to come back. I did come back. Marcus's hands clenched at his sides. I came back to find our ranch burned to the ground and everyone saying you died in the fire. Your father. He told me himself, said there was nothing left of you to bury. The pieces of a 3-year-old puzzle began falling into place. Sarah's father, who'd never approved of her relationship with a drifting cowboy. The same man who'd driven her from town when her pregnancy began to show, calling her a shame to the family name. The same man who'd apparently told Marcus she was dead, rather than admit his daughter had run away to spare the family scandal. He lied, Sarah whispered. Papa lied to both of us. Marcus took a step forward, then stopped, as if an invisible barrier held him back. You're alive. All this time you're alive. Officer Martinez cleared his throat awkwardly. Folks, if we could just... There's been a mistake, Marcus said, never taking his eyes off Sarah. Mrs. Blackwell, your car is waiting for you at Henderson's. Lot, you paid for it, but you never picked it up. Joe Henderson called it in this morning, said a customer was raising hell about a stolen car that was sitting right there in his lot. Karen's face cycled through several shades of red before settling on a mortified pink. Oh God. I saw this car and I was so sure. She looked around at the gathered neighbors, all of whom were now staring at her with expressions ranging from amusement to disgust. I'm so sorry. I don't know what came over me. But Sarah barely heard the apology. Her world had narrowed to the man standing before her, so close she could reach out and touch him, so far away he might as well be on another planet. 3 years of grief and loneliness stretched between them like an ocean of unsaid words. Have to go, she said suddenly, panic rising in her throat. She couldn't do this, couldn't let herself hope again. Not when hope had nearly destroyed her the first time. She moved toward her car, but Marcus stepped into her path. Sarah, wait, please, we need to talk. About what? The words came out sharper than she'd intended. Ow! About how you believed I was dead and never even looked for my body? About how I've been living in this godforsaken subdivision for 3 years, trying to forget you ever existed? Pain flickered across his features. I looked. God help me. I looked everywhere. I dug through the ashes with my bare hands until they bled. I found your jewelry box melted beyond recognition, and I thought I'd lost you forever. The crowd was growing larger. Neighbors emerging from houses up and down the street to witness the drama unfolding on Sarah's front lawn. She could feel their eyes like brands against her skin, and the familiar shame crept higher, threatening to choke her. Can't do this here, she said. Not like this. Not with everyone watching. Marcus glanced around at the gathered spectators, his jaw tightening. Then where? When? Sarah, I've mourned you for 3 years. I've lived in hell thinking I failed to protect you. Don't ask me to just walk away now that I know the truth. Martinez stepped forward again. Folks, why don't we clear the street? Show's over, people, Mrs. Blackwell. Your car situation is resolved. Mrs. Mitchell, you're free to go about your day. The crowd began to disperse reluctantly, neighbors shuffling back to their houses with disappointed expressions. Karen Blackwell hurried away without another word, her face buried in her hands. But Marcus remained rooted in place, his eyes locked on Sarah's face as if she might vanish again if he looked away. I work at the sheriff's department now, he said quietly. I've been here for 6 months. If I'd known, if I'd had any idea you were alive, I would have found you sooner. 6 months. 8. He'd been in the same town for 6 months, and their paths had never crossed until this morning. Sarah thought about all the times she'd driven past the sheriff's office. All the mornings she'd bought coffee from the shop across the street. How many chances had they missed? Why did you come here, she asked. To this town, I mean? Marcus looked down at his boots, and Sarah saw the boy she'd once known in that gesture. I followed a lead. Someone said they'd seen you in the next county over. It turned out to be false. But I'd already taken the job, I guess. I guess I stayed because it felt closer to you somehow. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. While she'd been trying to forget him, he'd been searching for her. While she'd been building walls around her heart, he'd been following ghost trails and false hopes, never giving up on a love she'd thought was buried forever. I have to go, she said again, but this time the words lacked conviction. Sarah, please. Marcus stepped closer, and she could smell the familiar scent of leather and sage that had always clung to him. I know this is overwhelming. I know it's been 3 years and everything's changed. But we loved each other once. Doesn't that mean anything? Once, she repeated, the word tasting bitter on her tongue. That was a lifetime ago, Marcus. We were different people then, were we? His voice was soft, intimate, as if they were the only 2 people in the world. Because looking at you now, I feel exactly the same as I did the day I left. The day I promised to come back and marry you, the memory hit her with devastating clarity. Marcus holding her in the barn loft moonlight, streaming through the gaps in the boards, his hands gentle in her hair as he whispered promises of forever. She'd worn his grandmother's ring on a chain around her neck. Hidden from her father's disapproving eyes, counting the days until Marcus returned and they could finally be married. You left, she said, and the accusation hung between them like smoke. You chose that cattle drive over me. It was supposed to be our future. Marcus's voice cracked with emotion. The money from that drive was going to buy us land, Sarah, a place of our own where your father couldn't touch us. I was trying to build something worthy of you. Didn't need land, she whispered. I needed you. They stood there in the aftermath of words that should have been spoken 3 years ago. The morning sun, climbing higher in the sky, painting everything in shades of gold and regret. Sarah felt the careful walls she'd built around her heart beginning to crumble, and it terrified her. I should go, she said for the 3rd time, but she made no move toward her car. Marcus reached out slowly, as if approaching a wild animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. His fingers brushed hers, barely a touch, but it sent electricity racing up her arm. I get off work at 6, he said. There's a diner on Oak Street called Millie's. If you, if you want to talk, really talk, I'll be there. I'll wait as long as it takes. Sarah looked down at their joined hands, his calloused and strong, hers trembling like aspen leaves. For a moment, she let herself imagine what might happen. If she showed up at that diner, what they might say to each other, what might be possible after all these years of grief and separation. But then reality crashed back in, cold and unforgiving. She pulled her hand away and stepped back, wrapping her arms around herself like armor. Some things can't be fixed, Marcus, she said. Some hurts run too deep. She got into her car before he could respond, her hands shaking as she started the engine in her rearview mirror. She watched him standing in the middle of the street, growing smaller as she drove away. But even when she could no longer see him, she felt his presence like a flame against her back, warming parts of her sheed. Thought had frozen forever. The rest of the day passed in a haze of nervous energy and second-guessing. Sarah tried to focus on her work shay, kept books for 3 small businesses in town, but the numbers blurred together on the page, replaced by memories she'd buried so deep they'd turned to fossils. She remembered the first time she'd seen Marcus. At a barn dance when she was 17, he'd been new to town then, hired on at the McClure Ranch. With his hat pulled low, and his eyes taking in everything with quiet assessment. He hadn't asked her to dance, hadn't even spoken to her that night. But something in his stillness had called to the restless part of her soul. It had taken 3 more dances and 2 church socials before he'd finally approached her, hat in hand, and words stumbling over themselves like colts learning to run. "Miss O'Connor," he'd said, "I was wondering if you might like to take a walk with me after the service next Sunday." Her father had forbidden it, of course. Patrick O'Connor had bigger plans for his daughter than a drifting cowboy with no family name and no prospects. But love, Sarah had discovered, paid no attention to father's plans. She'd met Marcus in secret stolen moments in the barn, letters hidden in hollow trees, kisses in the shadow of the general store when everyone else was at church for 2 years. They'd loved each other in the spaces between her father's watchful eyes. Marcus had been gentle with her innocence, patient with her fears, and absolutely certain that their love could overcome any obstacle. He'd spoken of marriage like other men spoke of weather, inevitable, natural, something that would simply happen when the time was right. But time, Sarah had learned, had its own plans. Now, sitting in her quiet house as the afternoon shadows lengthened, Sarah found herself thinking about that last night before Marcus left. They'd made love with desperate intensity, both of them sensing that. Something was changing, that their stolen paradise was about to be tested by the harsh realities of the world. "I'll be back before the leaves turn," he'd promised, his breath warm against her ear. "And when I come back, I'll have enough money to buy us a spread of our own. Your father won't be able to say, 'I'm not good enough for you anymore.'" She'd wanted to tell him that she didn't care about her father's approval, that she would have run away with him right then with nothing but the clothes on her back. But Marcus had his pride and his dreams, and she'd loved him too much to ask him to abandon either 2 months later. She'd stood in the ashes of her childhood home, her father's lies ringing in her ears. Carrying Marcus's child and nowhere left to run except away, the baby had been born in a charity hospital in Denver, a daughter, with Marcus's dark hair and her own stubborn chin. Sarah had held her for exactly 3 minutes before the nurse took her away to the couple who'd already fallen in love with the idea of her. Sarah had signed the papers with hands that felt like they belonged to someone else. Her heart breaking with each stroke of the pen, it had been the right choice, she told herself, then and now. The baby would have a real home, to parents who could provide everything Sarah couldn't. But giving up her daughter, Marcus's daughter, had been like losing him all over again, only deeper this time, like having her soul surgically removed. The clock on her mantel chimed 6 o'clock. Sarah's heart jumped like a startled bird. Somewhere across town, Marcus was probably sitting in Millie's diner, checking his watch and hoping she might walk through the door. The thought filled her with equal parts longing and terror. She could go. She could get in her car, drive to Oak Street, and sit across from him in a vinyl booth while they tried to piece together the fragments of their broken love story. She could tell him about their daughter, about the choice she'd made, and the way it had hollowed her out from the inside. She could let herself hope again, or she could stay home, safe in her carefully constructed solitude, protected from the kind of hope that could destroy a person twice. The phone rang, startling her. Out of her spiraling thoughts, the caller ID showed her neighbor Mrs. Henderson's number, and Sarah almost let it go to voicemail. But something made her pick up. "Sarah, dear," Mrs. Henderson's voice was uncharacteristically gentle. "I hope you don't mind me calling. I wanted to apologize for all that nonsense this morning with Karen Blackwell. That woman has more mouth than sense, and I'm sorry you had to deal with her foolishness." "It's all right, Mrs. Henderson. These things happen. They shouldn't happen to nice people like you." There was a pause, and Sarah could hear the older woman's breathing, as if she were working up courage for something. "Sarah, I couldn't help but notice that police officer seemed to know you. The way he looked at you reminded me of how my Harold used to look at me back when we were young and foolish." Sarah's throat tightened. "Mrs. Henderson, now, I'm not one to meddle in other people's business usually," the older woman continued, which was such a blatant lie that Sarah almost smiled despite herself. "But I've been watching you for 3 years now, child. You're carrying a hurt so big, it's wearing you down to nothing. And this morning, just for a moment, I saw something different in your face, something like hope." The words hit Sarah like a gentle slap, true enough to sting. "Sometimes hope isn't enough," she said quietly. "Maybe not," Mrs. Henderson agreed. "But sometimes it's all we've got. Sometimes, if we're very lucky, it's exactly enough." After hanging up, Sarah stood at her kitchen window again, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. The sky was painted in shades of rose and gold, beautiful enough to break hearts or mend them, depending on your point of view. In the distance, a train whistle called across the prairie, lonely and haunting. At 6:30, she was still standing at the window. At 7 o'clock, she was getting dressed. By 7:15, she was in her car, driving toward a reckoning 3. Years in the making, Millie's Diner sat on the corner of Oak and 3rd, a relic from the 1950s, with neon signs and red vinyl booths that had seen better decades. Sarah parked across the street and sat for a moment, gathering courage like armor around her heart. Through the window, she could see him. Marcus sat in a corner booth, his uniform hat on the table beside a cup of coffee that had probably gone cold an hour ago. He was staring out the window at the darkening street, and even from a distance, Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the coffee cup like a lifeline. She almost turned around then, almost drove home to her safe, quiet house where the only heart that could be broken was her own. But something in his stillness called to her, just as it had all those years ago at that first barn dance. The bell above the door chimed as she entered. Marcus's head snapped up, his eyes finding hers across the diner. The relief that washed over his face was so profound it nearly brought her to her knees. "You came," he said, as she slid into the booth across from him. "I'm here," she replied, which wasn't quite the same thing. The waitress appeared instantly. A matronly woman with kind eyes and the name Dolores embroidered on her uniform. "What can I get you, hon?" "Coffee," Sarah said. "Black." "Coming right up? You folks want some pie? We've got fresh apple." "No, thank you," Sarah said, but Marcus nodded double quotes to pieces. He said, apple was always her favorite. The casual intimacy of his words, the fact that he remembered something so small after all these years, made Sarah's chest tight. When Dolores bustled away, they were left alone with the weight of everything unsaid, stretching between them. "Look good," Marcus said finally. "Different, but good." Different how? He studied her face with the intensity of a man trying to memorize something precious. "Sadder," he said at last, "like you've seen too much of the world's sharp edges." Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Haven't we all? Some more than others?" Marcus reached across the table, stopping just short of touching her hand. "Sarah, I need you to know, I never stopped looking for you. Even after I came to accept that you were dead, part of me kept looking. I think I would have looked forever. But you didn't find me." "No," he admitted. "I failed you in that, just like I failed you when I left." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with regret and self-recrimination. Dolores returned with the coffee and pie, bustling around their table with determined cheerfulness before. Disappearing again into the kitchen, Sarah wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, grateful for the warmth. "Tell me about the cattle drive," she said. "Tell me what happened." Marcus's face darkened. "Rustlers hit us 2 days out of Abilene. They killed the trail boss and 2 of the other hands. The rest of us barely made it out alive. I took a bullet in the shoulder that got infected, laid me up in a hospital for 2 months. 2 months. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. "You were in a hospital for 2 months? Delirious with fever for most of it? By the time I was coherent enough to write a letter, it was November. I came home to find," he swallowed, "hard to find nothing. The ranch house was a pile of charred timber. Your father said you'd been inside when it happened, that there was a lantern accident. He said they couldn't even find enough of you to bury properly. The picture was becoming clearer now, the cruel machinery of fate and deception that had torn them apart." Sarah could see her father's calculating mind at work. Marcus, gone longer than expected, giving him time to orchestrate his lies. The fire had probably been real, but timed to coincide with Sarah's absence. allowing Patrick O'Connor to claim his daughter had perished while simultaneously hiding the shame of her unwed pregnancy. He sent me away, Sarah said quietly. When? He found out I was, when he realized I was carrying your child. The words fell into the space between them like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock across Marcus's features. The coffee cup slipped from his nerveless fingers, clattering against the saucer. A child? His voice was barely a whisper. Sarah nodded, tears threatening to spill over. A daughter. She was born in Denver in February. I gave her up for adoption. Marcus went perfectly still, so motionless he seemed carved from stone. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw with anguish. You were alone. You went through all of that alone. I thought you were dead too, Sarah said. Papa showed me a telegram from the cattle company. Said you'd been killed by rustlers. Thought I'd lost everything, our daughter. Marcus's hands were shaking now. She would be, 2.5 now? Almost 3? Born February 14th? Valentine's Day? Sarah managed a watery smile. I thought it was fitting somehow. A child born of love. Even if it was love that couldn't survive the world. What did you name her? The question broke something loose in Sarah's chest, and the tears came then, hot and heavy. I didn't. I couldn't. The adoptive parents named her Emma. Marcus was out of the booth and around to her side before she could blink. Sliding in beside her and pulling her against his chest. She buried her face in his shoulder and sobbed for everything they'd lost their love. Their daughter, 3 years of life they could have shared. Sorry, Marcus whispered into her hair. God, Sarah, I'm so sorry. If I'd known, ... if I'd come back sooner. It's not your fault, she managed between sobs. It's not anyone's fault. It's just ... life, the way things happen. But even as she said it, Sarah felt the anger burning in her chest, anger at her. Father for his lies, at fate for its cruelty, at herself for giving up to Isley. She'd spent 3 years telling herself that she'd done the right thing, that their daughter was better off without parents who couldn't even find each other. But now, with Marcus's arms around her and his heart beating steady against her cheek, she wondered if she'd been lying to herself all along. Do you know where she is? Marcus asked. The family who adopted her? Sarah pulled back to look at him, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. The lawyer said they lived in California. A teacher and his wife who couldn't have children of their own. That's all I know. We could find her, Marcus said, his voice intense with sudden purpose. I'm a cop now. I have resources. We could know. Sarah shook her head firmly. Marcus. No. She has a family. Parents who love her. We can't disrupt that child's life because we found each other again. But she's our daughter. Was our daughter for 9 months. Sarah's voice was gentle but implacable. Emma belongs to the people who've raised her, who've been there for every milestone we missed. We gave up the right to claim her when we signed those papers. Marcus looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Sarah's expression stopped him. They sat in silence for a while, processing the magnitude of what they'd learned. A daughter. They'd never know. A family they'd never be. What about us? Marcus asked eventually. Is it too late for us? Sarah looked at him. I looked at him for the first time since walking into the diner. The boy she'd fallen in love with was still there in the set of his jaw and the depth of his eyes. But he'd been tempered by loss and hardship into something stronger. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, a gravity to his bearing that spoke of responsibilities shouldered and promises kept. I don't know, she said honestly. I'm not the girl you knew, Marcus. These 3 years ... they changed me. The things I've seen, the choices I've had to make. I don't know if I remember how to trust in happy endings anymore. Then we'll start small, Marcus said. We'll start with coffee and conversation. We'll start with learning who we are now, instead of trying to be who we were then. Such a simple proposition, but Sarah could see the hope burning behind his eyes like a candle in a window, drawing her home from the cold. Part of her wanted to run from that hope, to protect them both from the possibility of losing each other again. But a larger part, a part she'd thought was dead and buried, whispered that some chances were worth taking. "Okay," she said, the word barely more than a breath. "Okay, we can try." Marcus's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. "That's all I'm asking for. A chance to try." They talked until Millie's closed around them, sharing the stories of their separate journeys through grief and healing. Marcus told her about the dark months after he'd thought she died. The way he'd thrown himself into dangerous situations with the recklessness of a man who had nothing left to lose. He'd eventually found his way to law enforcement, channeling his need for justice into something constructive. Sarah told him about Denver, about the boarding house for unwed mothers where she'd lived during her pregnancy, about the job she'd found keeping books for a small company after Emma was born. She'd worked hard and saved every penny, eventually moving to Millbrook where she could disappear into suburban anonymity. "I convinced myself I was happy," she said, as they walked to their cars in the empty parking lot. "I had work, a nice house, quiet neighbors. It was safe." "Safe isn't the same as living," Marcus observed. "No," Sarah agreed. "But it was easier than hoping." They stood beside her car, neither wanting to be the first to leave. The night was clear and cool, stars scattered across the sky like scattered dreams. In the distance, another train called across the prairie, its whistle carrying the promise of journeys to unknown destinations. "Can I see you again?" Marcus asked. "Tomorrow?" Sarah hesitated, old fears warring with new possibilities. "I don't want to move too fast," she said. "We need to be careful, Marcus. We need to be sure." "I'm sure," he said simply. "I've been sure for 3 years, even when I thought you were dead. But I understand if you need time." She reached out and touched his hand, just briefly. "Sunday," she said. "There's a church picnic on Sunday. The whole town goes. It might be easier with other people around. Sunday it is." Marcus lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Sweet dreams, Sarah." She drove home through the quiet streets with her heart hammering against her ribs and her mind spinning with possibilities. For the first time in 3 years, the future felt like something more than an endless series of identical days, stretching toward an inevitable ending. But as she pulled into her driveway, Sarah saw a car parked across the street that made her blood run cold. It was a black sedan with Colorado plates, and she recognized it with the certainty of nightmares made manifest. Her father sat behind the wheel, his face pale in the streetlight, watching her house with the patience of a hunter. Patrick O'Connor had found her at last. Sarah sat in her car for a long moment, gathering strength for a confrontation she'd been dreading for 3 years. Finally, she got out and walked across the street, her footsteps echoing in the quiet night. "Papa," she said when he rolled down his window. "Sarah." Patrick O'Connor had aged badly in the years since she'd seen him. His hair had gone completely gray, and there were deep lines carved around his eyes and mouth. "You're looking well." "What do you want?" she asked, cutting through pleasantries with surgical precision. "I want to talk to my daughter." "Can a man visit his own child? You gave up that right when you lied to Marcus?" "When you told him I was dead?" Patrick's face didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, guilt, perhaps, or just annoyance. "At being caught, I did what I had to do to protect our family's reputation." "You destroyed our lives to protect your reputation," Sarah corrected. "Marcus and I, and our daughter, that bastard child was better off without you," Patrick said, his voice harsh. "And you're better off without that drifting cowboy. So look at what you've built here, a respectable life, a good job. You can still find a decent man, Sarah. It's not too late." "I found the man I wanted 8 years ago," Sarah said, "and you stole him from me with your lies." Patrick leaned forward, his eyes intense. "He would have ruined you. Men like that, they take what they want and move on. He would have left you eventually, probably with a house full of babies and no way to support them. You don't know Marcus? I know his type. I've seen 100 cowboys come through town, all charm and pretty words until something better comes along. That's why I sent him away, Sarah, to save you from heartbreak." Sarah stared at her father, seeing clearly for perhaps the first time the narrow, frightened man who had shaped so much of her life. He genuinely believed he'd done the right thing, she realized. in his twisted logic, destroying her happiness, had been an act of love. "Go home, Papa," she said quietly. "There's nothing for you here." "I'm not leaving without you," Patrick said. "Your mother's been sick, Sarah. She needs you. We all made mistakes, but it's time to come home and face your responsibilities." For a moment, Sarah felt the old pull of family obligation, the weight of a daughter's duty. Then she thought of Marcus waiting for her at the church picnic, of the hope she'd seen burning in his eyes, of all the years she'd wasted living in the shadow of her father's fears. "No," she said. "I'm done running from my life, and I'm done letting you control it. If Mama needs me, she can write to me herself. But I'm staying here." Patrick's face darkened with anger. "You're making a mistake, Sarah. That man will break your heart again." "Maybe," Sarah agreed. "But that's my choice to make." She walked away while he was still sputtering protests, her steps growing stronger with each stride. Behind her, she heard his car engine start, but she didn't look back. Some bridges were meant to burn. Inside her house, Sarah leaned against the front door and allowed herself a moment of trembling relief. Through the window, she watched her father's taillights disappear into the night, carrying with them the last hold her past had on her present. The next 2 days passed in a strange suspension of time. Sarah went through the motions of her normal routine work. Grocery shopping, tending her small garden, but underneath the ordinary surface of her life, something fundamental had shifted. It was as if she'd been living underwater for 3 years and had suddenly remembered how to breathe. Marcus called twice, just to hear her voice, and each conversation left her feeling lighter. They talked about small things, the weather, a book she was reading, a case he was working on involving stolen chickens, but underneath the mundane words ran an electric current of possibility. "I keep expecting to wake up," Marcus confessed. During their second call, to find out this is all some elaborate dream my mind conjured up to torture me. "I know the feeling," Sarah said. "If it is a dream, let's not wake up just yet." Sunday dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect spring day that made the whole world feel new. Sarah stood before her bedroom mirror, trying to decide what to wear to a church picnic that felt more like a first date. She'd changed clothes 3 times already, cycling through options that made her look too eager, too formal, or too much, like she was trying to be someone she wasn't. Finally, she settled on a simple blue dress that Marcus had once said brought out her eyes, paired with a white cardigan and comfortable walking shoes. It wasn't fancy, but it was honest. And honesty felt like the only foundation worth building on. The picnic was held in Riverside Park, sprawling green space along the banks of Mill Creek where the whole town gathered for summer celebrations and community events. Sarah arrived early, hoping to settle her nerves before facing the curious stares and whispered conversations that were bound to follow yesterday morning's drama. But the whispers never came. Instead, she was greeted with warm smiles and friendly waves from neighbors she'd barely spoken to in 3 years of living among them. Mrs. Henderson bustled over immediately, her arms laden with covered dishes. "Sarah, dear, don't you look lovely? Here, help me get these potato salads to the food table before my arthritis acts up." As they walked across the park together, Mrs. Henderson leaned in conspiratorially. "That police officer friend of yours is here already? He's been helping Reverend Mitchell set up the game booths for the last hour. And I swear half the single ladies in town have found excuses to wander over and introduce themselves." Sarah felt an unexpected stab of jealousy, followed immediately by the absurd urge to march over and stake her claim. Instead, she managed a casual, "Don't you worry, though," Mrs. Henderson continued with a knowing smile. "That man only has eyes for one person, and she's standing right next to me." They reached the food tables, long planks set up under the shade of ancient oak trees and covered with checkered tablecloths. The traditional spread of a small-town potluck was already taking shape: casseroles and salads, pies and cakes, fried chicken and barbecued ribs that filled the air with mouth-watering aromas. Sarah. She turned to find Marcus approaching, and her heart did that familiar skip it had been doing since she was 17. He'd traded his uniform for civilian clothes, dark jeans, and a white button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing strong forearms that still made her pulse quicken. "You came," he said, and she heard the echo of his words from the diner, the same relief and wonder. I said I would. You did. But saying and doing ... Well, I've learned not to take either for granted. They stood there, smiling at each other like teenagers, until Mrs. Henderson cleared her throat meaningfully. Marcus, dear, would you mind helping me arrange these dishes? These old hands aren't as steady as they used to be. For the next hour, they worked side by side, setting up food tables and arranging chairs, their shoulders brushing in casual contact that sent sparks racing along Sarah's nerve endings. The easy familiarity surprised her. They fell back into the rhythm of shared tasks as naturally as if the 3 years between had been 3 days. You two make a good team, observed Reverend Mitchell, the elderly minister who'd baptized half the town and married most of their parents. It's nice to see Sarah looking so happy. She's been carrying sadness like a stone in her pocket since she moved here. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, but Marcus just smiled. She's always been the best part of any team lucky enough to have her.